Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today, we'll be covering off a demonic succubus possession film from 2009, famously starring Megan Fox as the titular character. It's the story of a small town that in the mid-2000s suffered a series of violent murders, and shockingly at the hands of a then high school student. And as investigators probe into these deaths, unearthing a possible cult-inspired connection, the claims of the killer herself tell another story entirely, one that involves obsession, infidelity, and, if you believe the assailant, possible possession. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Jennifer's Body. It's springtime in the small town of Devil's Kettle, USA, and in the late hours of the night, firefighters and 911 dispatch receive a frantic phone call alerting authorities to a blazing fire at a popular local bar. Now, when responders first arrive at the scene, they find the establishment itself, named in reports as Melody Lane Tavern, completely and utterly engulfed in flames. Tragically, the fire itself started during the midst of a large-scale gathering, where patrons had gathered to attend a concert for a traveling rock band named as Low Shoulder. Ultimately, the fire was deemed to be accidental, caused by some kind of electrical malfunction, and while firefighters are eventually able to quell the flames, the fire itself would claim the lives of many Devil's Kettle locals, 8 of which were allegedly underage high school students. And while this tragedy would make major headlines both locally and abroad, it would prove to only be the beginning of the series of violent events that would rock the community, resulting in the murder of numerous high school students in the area at the hands of suspected teenage serial killer Anita Lesnicki. Now, before we get into the murders themselves and eventually the bizarre and twisted motives behind Anita's actions here, I think it's important to acknowledge just truly how shocking these murders and the identity of the killer herself were to the community in Devil's Kettle. Anita Lesnicki was a near straight-A student in high school, where her peers indicated in subsequent news interviews that she mostly kept to herself and was generally quiet and kind to other students and faculty there. She lived with her single mother, Toni Lesnicki, on the outskirts of town, and otherwise had no prior police records at the time that the murders took place. And while on the surface, Anita seemed to live the life of an otherwise regular high school teenager, the truth would prove to be far more deranged, including a satanic interest and an unhealthy obsession with her own best friend and future murder victim herself, high school cheerleader captain Jennifer Check. Now, these killings famously began in the days following the fire at Melody Lane, and while the first victim discovered would be that of Devil's Kettle High School football captain Jonas Kozel, police actually believe here that Anita's first victim was that of another high schooler, a male foreign exchange student that investigation notes name as Ahmet. Now, police and fire initially believed Ahmet to be a tragic victim in the flames that claimed so many lives at the local bar dive, after his body couldn't actually be located on scene, despite numerous witnesses noting him to be present during the aforementioned rock concert therein. While police were initially criticized for this miss, given Ahmet's body was located far from the scene at Melody Lane, many agree that this criticism is probably ultimately unfair. Now, due to the advanced fire damage, not only to the property itself, but also to the numerous bodies of the victims, it did take police and coroners some understandable time, in some cases weeks or days, to formally identify the victims of the blaze. So it's easier to understand here why they might have assumed that Ahmet was likely just unidentified among the dead at the time that the investigation took place. His body was found by passers-by along the interstate a few miles away from the scene of the fire itself. Like other victims in the Devil's Kettle case, he was found to have been killed via disembowelment. His stomach cavity was cut open by an unidentified sharp-bladed object, and some of his internal organs were not only removed, but allegedly showed signs of partial consumption. Now, while the killer herself would eventually go on to say that this consumption was due to the satanic and occult origins of her what many consider to be delusions, authorities here assume that this was actually more likely due to the nearby wooded areas being densely populated with wildlife, and that Amet's body was likely set upon by numerous carnivorous scavengers in the days prior to his discovery. And while Amet is chronologically considered to be the first victim of Anita Lesnicki, the first victim that was discovered was actually that of the aforementioned high school football star, Jonas Kozel. Jonas's body was found by one of the teachers at Devil's Kettle High School, located in the wooded area surrounding the school itself. Now, autopsy confirms that Kozel was killed in the same MO as other victims in the case. His internal organs were removed from his stomach cavity, and that he likely died from extensive blood loss and massive shock as the result of his wounds. Coroners estimate his time of death as only a matter of hours before his body was found, indicating that the suspected killer might have been a local, and perhaps even one who attended Devil's Kettle High. And while at the time of the investigation, police were unsure of this theory, it would ultimately prove to be shockingly close to the truth. But before a formal arrest would be made, it would be well over a month after police had backed off their initial investigation into the murder of Jonas Kozel, where they cited no major leads in the case, that the seemingly innocent teenage killer would strike again. Police received a formal complaint from a nearby neighborhood residence in Devil's Kettle, citing unfit living conditions and suspected dumping on a nearby property, indicated by a, quote, foul smell emitting from the residence in question. Upon entering the dwelling, that crime scene photographs indicate might have been some kind of an abandoned housing project, police discovered the decomposing body of high school student Colin Gray. The victim was located in the upstairs of an unfinished residential property, and his body was found in the same state as other victims in the case, albeit in a more gruesome and violent fashion. Blood samples taken from the scene were located on nearly every surface of the room, indicating rapid and extensive blood loss as the result of the victim's traumatic wounds to the torso. And other evidence discovered here, while seemingly inconsequential on the surface, may actually lean into theories that Anita Lesnicki was inspired by an almost cult-like obsession with mythical lore. The crime scene itself was adorned with candles, deliberately and specifically placed around the body in an almost sacrificial or ritualistic fashion. And as was the same with other victims in the case, Colin Gray was found to have been completely disemboweled, including the partial consumption of his internal organs. Now, once again, authorities note here that there were various vermin and rats and such present on the scene of the crime, because the area itself was seemingly condemned or under construction, so it is quite possible that these scavengers were once again responsible for the consumption of the organs. However, it is important to mention that the consumption of human flesh does directly tie into Anita Lesnicki's own obsession with the mythical succubus creature, which we'll get to shortly. Now, due to the fact that those who knew Anita best at the time of the crime spree that took place here were victims in the case, it's ultimately pretty difficult to determine the authenticity to these cult-like claims that Anita might have been obsessed with Satanism. However, interviews with surviving schoolmates and teachers indicate that Anita may have actually confided that she suffered a series of visions in the time period that these murders took place, including an unhealthy obsession in satanic lore shared by her longtime friend and future victim Jennifer Check. Students had claimed that Jennifer Check reported that Anita might have been mentally unstable in the months that the murders took place, including violent fantasies of murder that actually named various victims in the case, no doubt implicating her in some of those crimes. And while Anita herself would famously blame Jennifer Check in these murders, absolving herself of any wrongdoing, local library records show that Anita had checked out numerous reading materials pertaining to the occult, including that of a mythical creature known as a succubus. And as police and investigators would discover, this creature of lore was known to dispatch its victims through, you guessed it, disembowelment and consumption of their internal organs. Now, whether or not Anita was simply inspired by these fanatical stories, or whether she believed that she herself had somehow become possessed by the creature in question, is ultimately unclear. It's theorized here by investigators and experts that either way, the succubus story and the resulting obsession here was the inspiration behind Anita's murders, though famously, this killer's own testimony upon her eventual arrest would suggest otherwise. Now, before we get to these claims and official police statements, Anita Lesnicki would claim 2 more victims before being apprehended by police, the first of which was her own high school boyfriend, identified by authorities as teenage victim Chip Dove. Chip's body was recovered by authorities on the evening of April 18th, the same night that friends and family note that Chip was supposed to attend a semi-formal high school dance with then unknown murderer Anita Lesnicki. Now, when Chip failed to appear at the dance and ultimately didn't arrive home that evening, police executed a search of the area and were able to find his remains in an abandoned pool and recreation facility located near Devil's Kettle High School. Now, unlike prior victims in the case, Chip was determined to have been killed by a series of puncture wounds to the neck, resulting in rapid blood loss and his own eventual demise. While no murder weapon was formally recovered from the scene, blood samples matching that of Chip's DNA were also located on Anita Lesnicki's clothing that were recovered from her home during a subsequent search by authorities after Jennifer Check's own murder, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, this further implicates Anita Lesnicki in Chip's murder and ultimately provided enough information to charge her for the crime in question. Now, the remains of Jennifer Check, Anita's own best friend since childhood and arguably the most publicized victim in the case, were located by police the same night as prior victim Chip Dove. Jennifer's body was found in her bedroom on the first floor of the rural Czech residence on the outskirts of town. Her torso suffered multiple lacerations and a single penetrative wound to her chest cavity, which then fatally pierced her heart, severing her aorta and killing her almost instantly, according to investigators. Now, at the time of this murder, Jennifer's mother was actually present in the home, and in statements provided to police, it was actually this witness who saw Anita Lesnicki carrying out Jennifer's physical murder. The witness reports that upon hearing a commotion, she found Anita horrifically stabbing Jennifer to death on her own bed in the room in a seemingly completely unprovoked attack. Now, investigators note that a nearby broken window suggests that Anita had gained entry to the room by force, and due to the lack of signs of a struggle, she had likely took Jennifer by surprise in this murder. Now, responding police are able to successfully subdue Anita Lesnicki without incident, where they recover a retractable box cutter weapon that was found to have contained DNA samples that matched Jennifer Check's blood, indicating that it was likely the same weapon used in the murder. Anita was formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder and was subsequently admitted to the nearby Leech Lake Correctional Facility. And it's here that, according to statements from doctors and inmates therein, Anita had proclaimed her own innocence, offering an alternate and often controversial take on the murderous events in Devil's Kettle, USA. Anita's impact statement indicates that while she did express an interest in the satanic succubus lore, it was not to carry out the series of murders, but rather to stop her friend Jennifer Check, who in Anita's mind had become allegedly possessed in some kind of a mythical succubus demon ritual. And in the months of her incarceration at Leech Lake Correctional, Anita stood by her claims of innocence, that it was in fact Jennifer Check who committed the murders in question, and that in killing her, Anita was simply trying to stop further violence at the hands of this alleged other serial killer. Now, doctors and police here generally completely disregard Anita's claims here. The most likely scenario in this case, and in her own claims, is that Anita simply needed some kind of an alibi or someone to blame for the crimes, hoping to either reduce her own sentence or completely absolve herself, at least mentally, from any kind of guilt. In the investigation itself, there's actually no evidence to suggest that Jennifer Check was anything other than a victim herself, and that the actual serial killer of Devil's Kettle was indeed none other than Anita Lesnicki herself. Interestingly, police and psychologists suggest that it's also quite possible that during the initial murders of these otherwise innocent victims, Anita may have actually become involved in a romantic love triangle between herself and victims Jennifer and Chip, who was Anita's then boyfriend at the time. This would also potentially explain the no doubt violent actions towards those who were closest to her, compared to that of the seemingly random and albeit horrific murders of the other victims. It also kind of lends itself to the fact that while the initial victims were discovered in various stages of disembowelment, the later victims in the case seem to be almost crimes of passion. So it's quite possible then that these cases started as some kind of a ritualistic sacrifice or demonic obsession, and then spiraled into a jealous or rage-induced series of more personal murders to the killer herself. But before the case of the murders in Devil's Kettle would formally conclude, there would be one more interesting development offering a potential connection, though this new crime would take place miles away in Madison, Wisconsin, USA. Now, this new murder scene would involve not locals from Devil's Kettle, but rather simply visitors who were passing by, and it was notably all 5 members of the prominent rock band Low Shoulder. Now, at the beginning of this case coverage, we had mentioned that Low Shoulder had performed some kind of a rock concert at the tragically fated Melody Lane Tavern, the location that would burn down the same night of the performance. Now, these band members were discovered by a combination of fans and housekeeping services in a particularly violent scene, having been murdered by an unknown assailant in their high-rise motel room located within the city of Madison, Wisconsin. The methods of execution here tend to vary, but in many of the cases involve the victims being attacked with some kind of a large Bowie knife that was actually recovered from lead singer and murder victim Nikolai Wolf's own torso. And most interesting here, surveillance taken from the hotel security cameras seems to showcase a hooded individual leaving the premises, and specifically the same floor that these high-rise murders took place. And that individual bears a stark resemblance to that of convicted killer Anita Lesnicki. And even stranger, in the days prior to the discovery of these new bodies, local news in Devil's Kettle reported that some kind of an explosion took place in Leech Lake Correctional Facility, resulting in extensive structural integrity damage both to the grounds and to the building itself. While official reports don't actually indicate any escaped inmates, one has to wonder, could there be any validity to the theories that Anita Lesnicki somehow escaped to kill again? Or is it just some kind of a bizarre coincidence, perhaps motivated by the plentiful illegal drugs and narcotics that were located at the scene of the crime where the band was found? Well, we may never have the actual answers as to the deaths of the members of Low Shoulder. The murders in Devil's Kettle, including that of Jennifer Check, are considered a closed case by local authorities, attributed to the mentally unstable and ultimately incarcerated Anita Lesnicki. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Jennifer's Body. I remember this movie getting a lot of flack when it first came out, but if I'm being completely honest, it's kind of a guilty pleasure for me. While for the sake of the true crime twist I implicated Anita, which is indeed what actually happens in the movie, the film story itself doesn't mince words whatsoever, and is very clear that Jennifer Check, played by Megan Fox, is clearly possessed by some kind of a succubus demon. Now, without going into too many spoilers, because, the true crime version is quite different from the actual story in the movie, it's ultimately a pretty fun ride if you can hang with the very of-the-time character depictions. Like many of the jokes and writing in this 2000s era, some of it is kind of in poor taste these days, and it admittedly walks the line between being kind of sharp and smart and maybe thinking it's, a little more clever than it actually is. But in my opinion, it fits right in for a 2009 horror, and the story and characters were actually pretty interesting to me. Coincidentally, it sounds like they might actually be cooking up a sequel somehow, although I have no idea how that's going to work. So I guess we'll have to see if that materializes anytime soon. In the meantime, if you're curious about Jennifer's Body, it's available on multiple streaming platforms at the time of this release. And that's all for this week's episode. Next week, we'll be diving back into the 80s catalog for a true horror classic, one I've been wanting to cover since the start of this podcast. If you've got a guess as to what it is, drop us a comment on any of our our social media platforms at Inside the Mask Evan or at Inside the Mask on YouTube. And while you're at it, hit the like and subscribe or follow button to make sure you always keep up on our latest episode releases. As always, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.